Well, hello and welcome to another roundtable chat. This is the Concours virtual chat around the Hollywood cars. This is going to be a fascinating talk. Let me introduce myself first, if I may. My name is Richard Charlesworth, and you might have bumped into me at a classic event or may have heard me over the PA as I'm the Master of Ceremonies for the Quail, a motorsports gathering. I'm also curator and presenter of the Concours of Elegance at Hampton Court Palace and a presenter at the London Concours. I'm an established Concours judge and reasonably well known with quite a few from my previous association with Bentley, having worked for the company since 1974, most recently as the Director of Royal and VIP Relations, Head of the Heritage Collection, and then as Brand Ambassador until I retired in 2017. But more importantly, these wonderful experts in front of us, Jayne Ward is Disney Pixar's Creative Director for the world of cars, so consults on all cars-related projects around the world, providing automotive and franchise expertise to both Disney and its partners, covering everything from consumer products to theme parks. He also serves as a liaison with automotive manufacturers and museums working on Pixar-related projects. He also runs the Pixar Motorama Campus Classic Car Show, hosting vehicles from Jay Leno, Chip Foose, and the Peterson Museum, and as well as his own classic cars, of course. He's an honorary judge at Pebble Beach. He judges at Amelia Island, Audrain, and Hilton Head. So he's a busy guy when he's not making movies. John Mason Taylor is the former chairman and managing director of Lynx Motors, manufacturer of the Lynx D-Type and Lynx Eventer. Born into a family with a Jaguar collection, he's a lifelong sports car enthusiast and accomplished historic racer with lightweight E-Types and the Ford GT40. When he began to have some of the cars in the family collection recommissioned, he became a client of Lynx and in 1992 acquired the company. His current activities include consultancy services and judging at major international concours events, including Amelia Island and Salon Privé. And turning to Andy, last but not least, Andy bought his first car, age 15, which was a 1968 Fiat 124 Coupe. Woohoo. His second, obtained by spending his college saving funds, was a 1966 Ferrari 330 GT 2+2. Well, much the same, really. Since then, he's owned more than 150 cars, as well as numerous classic motorcycles and scooters, a veteran of film, television, advertising, and helping to launch internet-based companies. Andy writes for several publications and is the market analyst for Magneto magazine. He's an expert on European sports and luxury cars, and also a respected concours judge. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining us here to talk about the Hollywood class entries. Now, we've got 8 great cars to judge. We were just chatting about them, and we'll look at them more closely later. But Hollywood cars, this is cars that may be important in themselves, but their importance is gained from the fact that they have celebrity ownership. So, Jay, coming to you first, why are people drawn to celebrity ownership? What excites people about cars owned by celebrities?
A good question. I think the interesting thing is the car itself is obviously can be an interesting thing, but for your general public that may not be a car person that can't tell one car from another, to know that Elvis Presley drove that car obviously gives much more mass appeal. Sure. I also think it's interesting as an insight into, wow, I didn't realize that that celebrity was into that type of car. So there's a couple points of interest, I think, with that.
So the car speaks volumes about the owner as much the other way around, doesn't it?
It does. And for some reason, think of how much we've seen values go up for particular cars just because of the person who owned it. There's no other way to explain it except for just star power.
Well, there's an interesting point, because again, sometimes the cars on their own, you'd think, well, what would be so exciting about that? And we'll talk about our cars in a minute. But Andy, one for you, what impact on value does celebrity association have? It must be huge.
Well, it depends on the car. I talked to a lot of people about this, and one of the things I do is go to auctions a lot. For the 20 years, I've been to pretty much every auction there is of the top tier auctions and seen a lot of these cars sell. A great example is a couple years ago, I had the honor of consigning Janis Joplin's 356 at the New York RM auction. And it's a 356 Cabriolet, probably worth, in the condition, if it was a standard car, $140,000.
Okay, yeah.
We sold it for $1.76 million. So there's that, and that's a pretty good bellwether. Then there's the Steve McQueen 911S used in Le Mans which at the time, 7911S, a perfect example of a coupe, is probably worth $2.25 for the best example in the world these days, $1.3 million. It depends on the celebrity owner. You know, then there are other cars. Some of the cars on our list, you know, stardom wanes. People that remember who Clark Gable was are less people than there were 20 years ago. What's interesting is, you know, Paul Walker is the next up and comer for sure. He sold a bunch of M3s at Barrett-Jackson this year for tremendous money, for double the price, because they are Paul Walker cars. He had like 7 E36 M3s, and they all sold for record money because Paul Walker was associated. He's kind of effectively, in some ways, the Steve McQueen of his era. So it depends. I think there's definitely a half-life to these cars as star power goes, but the star stuff definitely makes a difference. You know, it's funny. Madonna sold a Mercedes a few years back, 6-7 years back at a Christie's sale, 380 Cabriolet, and I think it went for $225, and the going rate was $1.25 at the time, so effectively double. But other stars, you know, if you had like Pee Wee Herman's Volvo, no one's going to probably care as much. And if you had, you know, an actor from the 60s, something who's not very relevant, it'll factor even less, who's no longer thought of. It, you know, Roger Moore's P1800 would sell for a lot of money and did indeed sell for a lot of money. But people who once those stars get out of the limelight are not really known anymore, the values tend to level. So
and we're going to come in a minute to you know, you talked about Paul Walker. We're going to talk about, you know, which are the sort of car aficionados, who are the people whose opinion is rated in terms of buying cars. But John, if I may come to you, we've heard how valuable a star car can be, but how do you verify the ownership of that car? You know, it can make a huge difference, as we've heard from Andy. That you know, that particular car, if it was not owned by anybody special, it's worth X. If it's owned by somebody special, it's worth multiples of X. But how do you verify the ownership of that car?
Well, it's a very interesting question, Richard. I think it's important because of the difference in the values of these cars that the research needs to be conducted a lot more thoroughly than normally. It's a question of research with the factory, with perhaps the family of the estate. The internet provides a lot more of a resource these days, but also Photoshop is something that can be very prevalent as well. So I think you have to be very careful and look at photographs, but look at period photographs. One thing about celebrities and movie stars is they usually like to be photographed a lot, especially with their prized possessions, the cars. So it's as ever, buyer beware.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I would imagine that if whoever was the next owner after the famous person, you assume they were bright enough to get something that proved the fact that this was owned by that famous person, which then becomes an integral part of the car and certainly of its value and moves with it whenever it changes hands.
One of the common denominators with celebrity owners is that they often like to customize their cars, whether it was at the factory brand new or once they took ownership of it. The McQueen XKSS was a good example of that, Steve McQueen personalized that car. So unless it's been restored and those items have been taken away from it, there's usually some sort of visual reference or evidence that it was in fact owned by that person.
I mean, Andy, back to you. I mean, condition must matter to a degree, or does it not matter at all? You know, is celebrity ownership everything, or does the condition of the car make a huge difference?
Condition of the car can make a difference. You know, preservation class, to talk about something you talked about a couple of days ago, a preserved car that was owned by that person is going to probably be the top money, because that's all those bits are the things those people sat in and touched and felt.
Yeah.
It's a heck of a difference. But you know, a lot of the celebrity cars you'll see have been restored because they're simply old cars, and preservation wasn't a thing 20 years ago, or really wasn't that valued. Heck, it wasn't even a class of Pebble until 96 or something. So if you think about that, in the 70s, these were just old cars and they got restored. But you know, a Steve McQueen car can be that's a historic one, like a dune buggy per se. can be in scruffy condition and still do tremendous money.
Yeah.
But someone else, you know, an Elton John Bentley that's down on its heels of the 10,000 Bentleys he's owned over the years might be worth not that much, because people look at it, you know, Elton John's got definitely celebrity cred, but riding a 1980s Bentley is terribly expensive.
I'll just add one thing to that. Another huge factor is if that vehicle was driven by that celebrity in a movie as well. So when it's appeared on the screen, that adds tremendous value. So
That's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah.
Steve McQueen's 911S was the car he drove in Le Mans, and therefore, boom, much bigger. So,
if there's time at the end, I'll tell you a good story about the filming of Le Mans that Derek Bell told me. I don't know if you guys know it, when Derek was filming, but I'll come back to that if there's time. But Jay, just to stick with you, we were talking about, you know, a lot of the cars that we think of as, well, so I speak for myself when I say an older chap, not young ones like you, but, you know, to some of the younger kids, they haven't heard of some of these names. Yes, some of the big names, of course, they have, but Paul Walker's name was mentioned. But you know, who are the names that are going to pull a younger audience in terms of car ownership by celebrities?
You know, I mean, we are in a different time now where, you know, for instance, a celebrity that may be internet famous or just, you know, modern franchise movie famous is different than the stars we knew that might have had more legs to them, that were a well-known established movie star through a series of a lot of films. I mean, obviously somebody like Elvis Presley is iconic forever. And so that name will always mean something to people.
Yeah.
But to Andy's point earlier, less and less people might know who Greta Garbo or Clark Gable is now. That may be waning. On the other hand, somebody like a Paul Walker is hot now, but I would say 10 years from now, he may be less relevant to an upcoming generation as the Fast and Furious movies fade.
I mean, you mentioned Roger Moore. You know, would a Daniel Craig car or a Pierce Brosnan car be worth chasing today?
Well, that's a funny one, because the James Bond DB5s are probably the most iconic film cars of all time, but obviously it didn't belong to Sean Connery. It was a movie car. And so whether Sean Connery owned it or not was irrelevant in the value of those DB5s that they sold, because they were iconic film cars. So we do have to sort of separate the two in some cases. Famous in a movie like the Ghostbuster ambulance, or famous to the owner. Well,
John, come back to you. You know, we've talked about some of the well-known names here, but McQueen seemed to cross various boundaries, doesn't he? He crosses different genres because, yes, he was a movie star, but also he was a well-known driver. He drove cars, and on film, as you say, Jay, drove that actual car that you can see today in a movie. But who's the next Steve McQueen, John? I mean, apart from yourself, who's the next Steve McQueen?
It's a tough question, really, Richard. I've been thinking long and hard about it. I think the fact that McQueen was not just a movie star, but he was a real petrol head. He was a real car guy. And talking about the points earlier about Pierce Brosnan or Sean Connery, they're not really car guys. They were filmed with cars, and the cars themselves became famous. But I think if you think about car guys nowadays who are into racing, there's people like Patrick Dempsey.
Yeah, good example.
Tom Cruise has a need for speed from Days of Thunder, and then following on from that with cars and bikes. So I think Jay made a good point that the number of films that are being made by people, unless it's a franchise, we tend to forget about them much more quickly. So I think Steve McQueen really was a one-off. There were a number of people of his generation like James Garner, Paul Newman, who were involved, owned racing teams and racers in their own right. But it's difficult to find somebody who's immediately going to be the next Steve McQueen and have the longevity that Steve McQueen and his legacy has had, from everything from his cars to even his sunglasses. Everybody wants something of Steve McQueen. Well,
it is astonishing. And it's interesting that some of those people who become icons, and you mentioned Elvis, Jay, earlier, I mean, it's tough to find a similar person in today's media who's going to have that pulling power in 50, 60 years' time after they've gone. But here's a question for any of you. You know, we know these cars are famous because of their ownership and may well have appeared in some of the films. But for the owners, people who own them today, are they cars that should be driven, or should they just be looked at, displayed, and enjoyed? Should the owner be driving those cars? Andy, go on.
I would just because I'm me, I would always say yes. One of my favorite things to do was to drive the James Bond DB5 from Goldfinger, which people would argue shouldn't be driven, but it was so much fun to shoot the machine guns at people. I think all cars should be driven. You know, in the land of full classics, like some of the cars on our list, it becomes a much more hard thing to do. But for like things like that 911S that like we've been speaking of, or next KSS, those are drivable, usable cars now. I think it depends upon how usable and drivable they are for how they should be driven. For me, anything that has 2 seats, 2 doors, and 4 wheels is a drivable thing. Something that's 74 inches long, or as Jay says, it takes up 2 zip codes, is a much more challenging thing to drive in general, let alone as a daily basis. So,
well, as somebody who's driven a lower Bentley on the millimeter a few times, I know what you mean. But Jay, go on. Yeah, we talked about this car. That's one of the cars that we've got. We're going to talk about later. This Greta Garbo car. I mean, can you imagine driving that around town?
Well, I think Andy brought up 2 interesting points. One is how drivable or fun it is to drive. And as Andy also knows, a lot of cars that were used in movies are beaten terribly. They're just not treated well. To brag that your car was in a movie is to say that your car was abused by a film crew, to be honest. Most of them are brackets bolted on and things screwed to them, and the engine's left till they overheat, and they're treated terribly on a movie set, typically. But the one exception I would say to driving the wheels off of it is if the car is super original to the person who owned it back in the 40s or 50s, down to the leather. You may want to preserve the condition of those items, to Andy's point, that they've actually physically touched. Whereas if you keep driving it and using it, eventually that DNA sort of goes away.
I think it's important that that the owners of these cars actually drive them. Whether they drive the wheels off them, I don't think that's what it's about. But to actually sit in the seat that Steve McQueen sat in, hold the wheel, look through the windshield, that's part of the experience, and that's part of connecting with that celebrity. And I remember one of my most memorable moments was driving one of the factory XKSS's through London after attending a Louis Vuitton event at the Hurlingham Club at about 1 o'clock in the morning. And the guys turned up with the trailer and they said, well, we'll take it home. I said, no, I think I'll drive it. I drove it down to the South Coast. And that was very special because I had a Saliba connection with that car and that time that you don't have. And I don't think anybody has the best moments of car ownership remembering the car sitting in the garage. It's actually the moment when you drive it and just experience it. Just, you know, the sounds, the smell, all the senses are heightened.
That's right. I mean, as you know, I have a car manufacturer background. We worked at Bentley and Rolls-Royce and Bentley before that. And I think that in terms of the reputation enhancement of the brand, but also of the car itself, is much greater if you use it as it was intended. You know, if you take an important car around, especially one that was a performance car, a race car of some sort, if you take it around on the transporter and wheel it gently off and tell people not to touch it and wheel it back on, people do not think well of the car or of the owner or of the company that owns it well. But if you campaign a car, if you take it out there, you know, as people do, Goodwood Revival meeting, people are campaigning astonishingly important and valuable cars, but people love them for the fact that they do that. John Mason Taylor, you tell us about this car.
Well, Jaguar XK120. Jay's point earlier on, talking about the purity of form and line, that was the first model launched in 1948 at the London Motor Show, and it is purity in form. These cars with the XK140, 150 became heavier with regulations and safety more in mind. Yeah, fabulous example. Painted wire wheels, which is nice to see.
Yeah.
And a beautiful lady sitting in the passenger seat. So it looks as though it's ticked every box for me.
And a 120 top speed of 120 miles per hour. Is that right?
Yes, it did. Yeah. So that was the 120 OTS, which was open two-seater, complete with luggage rack there. But Clark Gable, he probably wasn't that comfortable probably sitting in that seat, because the distance between the bottom of the steering wheel and the driver's seat, there's very little room, and the steering wheel itself is very large, so not the most comfortable driving, but a marvelous driving experience.
And before you go off that image, Jay, I'm just, not that we're going to talk about them, but fascinating to look at the background. He's obviously somewhere with French speaking, we assume in France, with Entree in the background.
Right.
But look at the cars behind. Is that Porsche 356 or something there behind his head? And what's that behind the car as well?
He's got a 48 or 49 Cadillac sedanette fastback back there. He's got a Fiat Topolino back there that has an American military badge on the fender. So this is early post-war Europe, which is, you're bang on. I was looking at this thing. The car park alone is fascinating when you look at these period pictures, and his badges on the front of the car. He's mounted all the grill badges on a little bracket, which is a proper way to do that.
Yeah, I can see the AA badge, John, isn't it there? I think on the front.
It certainly is in the centre, and also modification to the bonnet, to the hood, where they put in louvers, which probably dealt with some potential overheating problems. So again, that's a good identifier for that particular car. Just to see that it had louvers, and they didn't come with louvers. They probably should have done. On the later models, the 140 and the 150, they made the grille larger, so to help with engine cooling.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, good to see. Great start. So, Jay, show us something else you got on the.
Right. Let's jump to this one. We can. Are you able to see that?
Oh yeah. So this is the Gold Bug, isn't it?
It's called the Gold Bug. Yeah.
Andy, do you know much about this?
I don't know. It's so past my prime of car stuff. I believe it's a one of, but owned by a 1920s movie star, meticulously restored. I believe it's been at Pebble, hasn't it?
I don't recall. If we zoomed in on that, the trophies on the running board there, it might tell us something about it. But I've been to Pebble every year for the last 20 years. I don't remember, but there's lots of cars at Pebble. But yeah, this is a 21 Kissel 645 Gold Bug, owned by Virginia Brown, as you say, silent movie star. It looks fantastic. It does look like it's been well restored for sure. And
it was a show car. Well, it was a Kissel show car that they used to show what they could do.
Okay.
So,
it looks great fun. I'm sure it'll be a lot of fun with that roof down little compact two-seater. Brilliant.
Yeah, one of those cars that also talks about not a star that we don't know as well anymore, because it's been 100 years since then.
Yeah.
Since Virginia Brown. Yeah. One of the awards on the front fender is a large Hershey's Kiss, which tells me that won at Hershey one year.
There you go.
The other thing I noticed is that the top, if you'll notice, the side windows are little porthole side windows, and you can see the back window is a round porthole back window that they've zipped up and placed up at the top, but really a nice little feature on the car.
Yeah.
Cool.
It's a lot of fun. Anyway, go on, move on. Let's see what else we got.
Move on. Okay, you guys might know this car.
Yes.
Found by Jackie Jouret from Bimmer, helped find this car from a magazine called Bimmer that was a BMW magazine here for years. She did a lot of research. This car was lost forever and found it, and she helped find it and helped verify it with BMW Classic.
So it's a 57 BMW 507, yeah? And the famous owner was, Andy?
Elvis Presley.
Elvis Presley. So presumably this was when he did his military service, is that right?
Correct.
So he was in Germany, when was this, 57? He was in Germany, did his nationals, did his time in the Marine Corps, or whatever it was, and this is what he drove, and I've seen pictures of him in the car. This is the car he drove when he was over in Germany. Did he bring it back with him, or did it stay there?
Brought it back. It got painted red. It got lost in a barn in Northern California, and it was found, what, 7-8 years ago, Jay? No?
Yeah, it's been all of that, if not more. And I was going to ask you about the verification, because that's one of those things Elvis had. You're right. He bought it as a European car and had it shipped back to the U.S. and had it repainted, and the trail was lost for many, many years. Was it a matter of finding paperwork in the car that had Elvis's name on it, or do you know the story of the verification?
Jackie wrote a whole like a 12-page thing in Bimmer on it, and I know it was in conjunction with BMW Group Classic, and they spent like 6 months verifying the car for being what it was. So I know that it's beyond challenging that idea of whose it is, because there was a long time people didn't know, and the guy that even owned it didn't even know, and it was just that he'd been told that but didn't know for sure. And I mean, it was sitting out as basically a rusty heap in his garage for years, for decades.
And it was in Northern California, so it was in my backyard, and I didn't find it.
Correct. Isn't that sad?
That's great.
There you
All
go.
right,
Could be yours, right? So that's going to
on.
be a hot contender for the title for sure.
Yes. This is a beautiful car. I mean, obviously restoration is at a 100, it looks like to me, and I saw it for Sheeny, Tipo 8. And this was a Rudolph Valentino car, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah. Now this, I understand. Now you guys may know this is a concourse winning car anyway, regardless of how well it does in our concourse virtual. But this has been seen in a number of concourse and has won awards. Unsurprisingly, when you look at that picture.
Stunning, absolutely stunning. Yeah. And I think to Andy's point, this is another a star now that has faded from a lot of people's memories. I mean, we know him as if you're an iconic Hollywood film fan, but your average film goer today who's just into pop culture and movies may not know that name.
Well, Valentino's name has appeared in a few songs in the last 20 or 30 years as well, but you're right. This is, you're getting on for 100 years ago, but Valentino, of course, great silent movie and speaky movie star as well, wasn't he?
Right. And here's another one, a classic car from another era, Greta Garbo's Duesenberg. And what a doozy it is with the length of this car. Obviously a coach built, dual spare, long bonnet car, just stunning. It
is. And you'd have to be a tall bloke to get into the trunk with that, wouldn't it, to get over the spare wheels. But that huge convertible roof, I mean, what an astonishing car. I think you referred to it as saying it would park in 2 zip codes. Is that what you said on this car?
That's right. Yeah, or 2 time zones or 2 zip codes or what have you. Yes.
But massive. It's astonishing. And again, it's going to be a great contender, I think, for the winner, because it is such an astonishingly beautiful car in itself, apart from its celebrity ownership by Greta Garbo. Again, many years ago, but still a name that's known today as one of the great legends of the early movie era.
Absolutely. I could have pulled up a modern picture of the car, but I thought this was such an interesting one because you can see she's not a really tall lady. And when you look at her height compared to the width of the door, it makes her look even smaller because the car is so massive. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Look at the huge step she's got to get in there as well.
All right. So moving on. This is I think a 48 Jaguar drop head coupe, 3.5 liter.
Yeah.
And this celebrity owner, Andy and I were speaking earlier, doesn't quite line up when you look at the car and you think, well, who owned this? What Hollywood sort of, person owned this car? You wouldn't think of Charles Bronson, but that is indeed who owned this car.
No, you're right. It doesn't speak Charles Bronson, does it? Either the car, the color of it, or anything. But it's there you go. Yeah, Charles Bronson car. So there's obviously a soft side to everybody, isn't there?
If you said, okay, what's a celebrity car that Charles Bronson would own? I would have said a Pantera, right? I would have said something like that. That feels very brute, very much like him. So.
Well, it looks like it's driving through a nice gate there anyway, just on its way out. But yeah, lovely car. Again, it looks like it's been very well restored. John, have you seen this one around?
I haven't, Richard. No, I was just thinking that I don't know whether I'd see Charles Bronson in any of his films driving a car like this. So maybe he just kept it for a quieter moments, so he could be perhaps incognito. He certainly would be if he was driving that.
Yeah, I think we all like Amelia. This would look at home at Amelia, wouldn't it? This would
yes,
on the lawns of Amelia.
Indeed.
Right. All right. Move on. Right. We're almost done.
From the Sublime to.
Now here's a car that's been well loved. Anybody in the UK appreciates the Land Rover. I think is this a Series 2?
Series 2, 62. Yeah.
Yeah. These are so great. They're so iconic. They're so simple, and yet they are the do everything off-road vehicle.
And of course ownership by Steve McQueen. So, and I was reading some of the background on this where he had this car in the UK when he was doing some filming, and he said on one occasion he was late getting somewhere. He said it was raining as usual, and he just was so worried about getting late, so he just went straight across the fields, across some farmers' fields to get to wherever he was going. He said because in a Land Rover you can, so he did. But there's great pictures in the collection of pictures around this of him in the car, and apparently they'd sit in the back and have a little drink or smoke something they shouldn't have been smoking. But it's a lovely. I have a car very similar to this. I've got a Land Rover similar to this, which the family just loves, and we just get a ordnance survey map out, get a map of Wales, and find a track you can go drive up, take a picnic, sit at the top of a mountain, and just enjoy the car. and they're just astonishing. Now, this is a beauty as well. I mean, Land Rovers have appreciated in value, of course, especially since they stopped making the original Land Rover. But, you know, Andy, this car, without the ownership of Steve McQueen, would be worth, you know, quite a bit. But suddenly, because it's Steve McQueen's, it's worth so much more.
Yeah, it would be 30 maybe, or 40 depending on the condition. But then it's Steve McQueen, so you know, at a zero. I mean, it's almost at a zero.
But you know, it's just such an iconic car. I'd love to see this in real life. I bet it's an astonishing car in real life to look at, because it's been loved and abused and enjoyed, and it is what it is. And as a number of the other pictures show, which we'll see when we're judging, you know, the photographers picked out all the, you know, the battle scars on it. It's a proper used car, and at least if you own this car now, you can continue to use it, because there's nothing much you can do to it to make it any worse.
That's right. I think it's also, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Jay. One of the great things about the Land Rovers, of course, is aluminum body. So
yeah.
There's no rust to worry about. So that's where so many of them survived.
No, you're right. In my old Land Rover, I'm loving the patina, as you say, John. I've just had some restoration work done on it last year, and we've kept the skin, peeled the skin off, put a new frame behind, put the old skin back on it. So it's got exactly the same appearance, but it's taken the bits out behind that, unlike the aluminium, do rust. And I know I was interested to see the registration number on Clark Gable's car was MDU. The registration number on my Land Rover is MUD, which is very appropriate.
Huh.
Anyway, great fun.
Speaking of number plates, this car has a European plate, the British plate still on one side, the California plate on the other side. The black plates in California, they stopped issuing those in 1969. In 1970, we went to a blue and yellow tag in 1970. So that means this was brought over sometime in the 60s.
Yeah,
so,
fantastic.
All right, our last vehicle, nothing super special here, just a little something at the end. Obviously, possibly one of the crown jewels of this whole group.
Well, it is, and it's in the Peterson now. Is that right?
Correct, in the Peterson's collection for a number of years now.
Well, Andy, tell us about your experience of this car.
Well, I have some experience in this car. When I was a very, very young in the business journalist in the automotive space, after movies and stuff, in the 2002 or 3, Dick, who used to run Peterson, offered me a tour. And I said, sure, I'd love to have a tour. And he said, hey, would you like to go to the vault? And back then, the vault was very secret. No one knew it existed. And it was basically where they stored the cars underneath that no one got to see, and until they were on display. And I said, sure, what's this? And we went down to the vault, and he said, would you want to drive something? And it was, the first car I wanted to drive was a Magnum PI Ferrari, and we drove that. And the other one was this. And he's like, hey, you know, I want to drive the XKSS. And I'd driven a couple already at this point, which was just a lucky chance. And I said, I didn't know whose it was. And so we jumped in the car and we go blowing down the road. And he goes, well, get on it. You know, it's a Jaguar XKSS.
Cool for Mr. Reed.
You get on, you make it move. And I said, okay. And so we're going way too fast. And he goes, oh, do you know whose car this is? And we're going into a turn. I'm braking, downshifting. I go, whose? He goes, Steve McQueen's. And I almost drove off the road. Literally, I mean, it scared the heck out of me. And I'm thinking, and he starts cracking up because he's planned this, because that's the way Dick is. And we drove back at like 30 in a 45 zone. I mean, I'm like, and because I knew what I was, I noticed the weird touches to it, but I didn't really frame it up. I didn't know enough about XKSS history to know what this was until after the fact. They're extraordinary cars. I've gotten to drive a lot of these, but you know, this is probably one of the most valuable celebrity cars there, period. Regardless of what you add to it. This is top tier. You know, his Ferrari 275 went for what, not 10 million? This is considerably different than that. This is, I can't even imagine. XKSS is probably worth somewhere between $8 and $14 million is my guess. Maybe more.
I think
it's looking stunning. John, I mean, you know, as the ex-owner of Lynx, you know a bit about Jaguars. Tell us about, I mean, leaving aside for a moment, if we can, John, the ownership of the car. Tell us about the XKSS.
Well, the XKSS Jaguar built 16 of them and converted 2 later. They had leftover chassis from the D-types really, and they were struggling at the time to sell them, so they converted them into road-going versions at the factory, and they struggled to sell them at the time. So I think it's one of the most beautiful Jaguars ever built. Obviously super rare. My connection with this particular car is that as a company, Lynx restored this car following Steve McQueen's death when it was purchased by one of his neighbors and sent to the UK. And it was in very original condition at that time, and it was refurbished and obviously retained a lot of its original features when it was restored at Lynx. So I was fascinated to look through the files and read up about the history of it. And in speaking to the guys who actually restored it, they were pains to point out that it was a very interesting project, but they had no real idea who Steve McQueen was. They just said, well, it's some actor who, I think he was in some car movie. So that was quite interesting to get that sort of low-key approach from something so famous. But yeah, it was very special, very fantastic car. And I think to put a value on it, Andy, is very difficult, isn't it? Because it's a one-off, and it's probably worth what one person is willing to pay. So if there's a Steve McQueen nut out there, I think the sky could be the limit on that car. But yeah, absolutely fabulous. And some nice individual touches that were done. Obviously, it was repainted when McQueen bought it secondhand, and had the wheels polished. Had Von Dutch carry out some alterations to the interior and some other modifications to it. But yeah, just absolutely stunning. So you're a lucky guy, Andy, to have the opportunity to drive it.
I didn't realize at the time until afterwards what that meant. What's interesting is all that Von Dutch stuff on the inside. When you guys restored this, it was really left alone and preserved in the best possible idea of the word. It seems like to me. There was a lot of patina on this car that was obviously original patina, and that's what I enjoyed the most, is that it was kind of the best of both worlds. It was mechanically and cosmetically nice, but you left the bits alone that should have been left alone.
Yeah, it was interesting because that was done in the 80s before I purchased the company, and as a lot of these cars were just seen as old cars, and the whole idea of preservation, they weren't seen in that light. But I think it was Richard Freshman who owned the car at the time, and he was very correct in making sure that it was not a restoration, but more of a refurbishment. Yeah. And to try and retain as much of that, of the Steve McQueen connection as possible. So it was done with a lot of respect.
Well, and it still looks fantastic today. I'm sure it's not quite as original as it was when you saw it or when Lynx had it, but it still looks fantastic. Well, that's brilliant. Jay, do you want to take us back to our screens? Well, thank you. A good walk through the cars that the judges have to consider in terms of the best of show and the runner-up, best of class and runner-up for the Hollywood class. One last question before we close, and thanks for the walk around there. Some great stories. Leaving aside the cars that we've just seen and the cars we've judged, you know, can you, what are the best examples of celebrity-owned cars that you guys have come across aside from these, or is this just the cream of the crop? Anything out there that you remember that you've seen a car, you've had contact with it, you've driven it maybe when you shouldn't have done, Andy? I mean, there's other cars out there. Is there anything else you guys have seen that would make a worthy contender in this class?
Well, it just sold at Mecum Auction a few months ago, but the Bullet Mustang is probably one of the most iconic as well, which was Steve McQueen and a movie car, you know, and it was lost and then it was found. And then the family that preserved it, Steve had tried to buy it back from them. They had documentation of his letter begging to buy the car back, and they turned him down. Yeah. That car just sold for, how much did it bring, Andy?
3 and change.
Over 3 million. Yeah. For a 67 Mustang Fastback, that's reasonable return on investment.
Yes. A rusty Mustang.
So that would be one I would wish was in this class.
Well, it's a good one. It's a great one. And so, yeah, that's it's interesting, as you say, especially if he tried to get it back and failed. Obviously, he wasn't bidding strong enough. Andy, anything else come to mind from you?
You know, there's a couple. Again, they're all Steve McQueen cars. This is so funny, and this talks about the whole celebrity power. I'm a personal fan of the fixed head coupe Silver Shadow that was used in Thomas Crown.
Oh yeah.
To sell it at Amelia this year, Bonhams, and somehow was withdrawn again. It's like been withdrawn 3 or 4 times from different sales. Because I just like the styling of that car. That car really appeals to me, and I like this. I like the movie. Also, the Nart Spider from that same film is a pretty interesting thing, and we all saw that sell in Monterey a few years back for tremendous money. Beyond that, most of the celebrity cars that really get me are the situations where the car is the celebrity.
Yeah.
Be it the D5 from Goldfinger and Thunderball, or Herbie, which is another celebrity car in itself. And that's a whole different thing. I've driven a bunch of those too, which is really silly. But those to me are, it's not the celebrity of the person who owned it. It's the car itself is the celebrity, is the movie star.
Yeah.
So
yeah. John, anything spring to mind for you?
Well, I think I'd agree that the Mustang and Bullet would do it for me. I remember first seeing it in the flesh at Amelia, and I was just so taken aback. And obviously, I've seen a lot of cars in various conditions, but it's a very special moment. Also, I do like the fixed head from the Thomas Crown affair as well. That was on display at Amelia, and there's just something about seeing these cars in the flesh after having seen them on the screen. It's just a wonderful moment. So, well, perhaps in future Concours we'll have the Mustang. Let's hope so.
That'd be good. That'd be good. It was quite nice. I mean, the original Thomas Crown, of course, fantastic film. But when it was remade with Pierce Brosnan playing the part, it was quite nice for Bentley when I was there, because he requested a Bentley Arnage to be used for his car. And he's, and you guys will recognize this. He comes, I've never met him, but he comes across as a genuine guy. And so when the film premiered, he got on to us and said, look, I'd love to have an Arnage to arrive at the red carpet, please. So that, it's consistent with the film, which of course was fantastic for us, because normally you're trying desperately to get cars into these things and having to pay somebody a lot of money to do it. But he was very loyal and enjoyed having the car. So anyway, guys, I'm going to press the stop record button. I want to we'll keep talking afterwards in a minute, but I just want to say thank you very much for your time. I hope everybody enjoys watching this, and it gives them a taste for the delightful cars we've got to judge on in terms of the Hollywood class. I think it was some great cars, and I thank you very much for your time.